Thomists are realists, or more properly, moderate realists. Now, the primary reference when the question of realism for Aristotle or Aquinas is usually raised is about the question of universals, finding a middle ground between the absolute realism of Plato, where universals or the forms or ideas exist independently and radically separated from the world of bodies, and the claims of nominalism, that universals are simply names we use, puffs of breath meaning nothing, according to Russell. Aristotle and Aquinas and their followers argue that universals really do exist in the intellect, but outside of the mind only as instantiated in individual beings. Of course, the moderate realism proffered in this context requires and implies a number of commitments that would be looked at skeptically at best by many contemporary philosophers of science. It implies a commitment to the immateriality and spirituality of the human mind, the mind, and with that the soul, and the matter-form composition of all physical bodies, including us. Now, the contemporary conversation around scientific realism is also concerned with the question of existence or ontology, but in this case it is focused more tightly on the existence not of abstract universals, but of particular concrete aspects of our scientific theories and models. In particular, the questions around the unobserved aspects of those models, or of those theories and models. In this paper, I'm hoping to shed some light on how, if at all, a Thomist committed to the moderate realism in the classical sense might be able to enter into the long-running and contentious debate about realism in contemporary philosophy of science. And in the process, I hope shed some light on Thomistic commitments that reveal a bit about why Thomists are more likely open to conversation about modeling and idealization in the sciences. To do this, I will be primarily engaging with the work of Anton Chakravarty, who has written a lot about scientific realism in different contexts, and with the particular sort of flavor of realism he has proposed. But before that, I want to look at some more recent work of his on more meta questions about the nature and prospect of solving this long-running debate about scientific realism. So I will first touch on and describe his discussion of what he calls epistemic stances, that he thinks colors the conversation and try to proffer something of a Thomistic epistemic stance, perhaps, with regard specifically to the question of scientific realism. Then I will try to engage more directly with the particular way that I think Thomists, if at all, might expect to be realists about science, now looking more closely at the particular claims that Chakravarty proffers as his preferred form of realism. And finally, I will try to engage this with, depending on time, some aspects of contemporary conversations about particle physics. Just as a possible caveat, I have a feeling that, in one sense, I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that I'm talking about both Thomistic philosophy of nature and contemporary philosophy of science. So some aspects will be very familiar to half of you, and other aspects will be very familiar to the other half. I'm also afraid that in the process of doing this, the way I'm going to present it, it might be dissatisfying to half of you for part of it, and dissatisfying to the other half for the rest of it. But we'll see how that goes. So, beginning just the idea of epistemic stances. So, for those of you not familiar, the idea of scientific realism, or the conversation about scientific realism, is the claim that there's some positive epistemic attitude toward the content of our best theories and models, recommending belief in both observable and unobservable aspects of the world described by those scientific models. Various forms of anti-realism that object to some aspect of this broad portrayal, for instance, rejecting that science can even attain to anything like objective truth, or that the language used about unobservable entities used in the sciences actually refer to real entities, or various forms in which you could object to the claim of scientific realism. So while Chakravarti has, again, argued for a particular form of this realism that he thinks is the best and most reasonable, in a more recent work on scientific ontology, he argues more broadly that despite the many years of debate and development around various forms of realism and anti-realism, claims about scientific ontology, which what science actually tells us is real, cannot be adjudicated purely on scientific, empirical, or historical grounds. Simply pointing to results of science, pointing to historical case studies aren't enough. There needs to be some aspect of some level of metaphysical speculation. This is metaphysical in the contemporary science context, contemporary philosophy of science context, or analytic philosophy, not the Thomistic context. I'll say a bit more about it a little later. He goes on to develop the idea that the plausibility of a particular piece of metaphysical speculation in this context is somehow rooted, can be understood as being rooted in the distance it has from more widely accepted empirical observation, the sorts of things that we can see with the senses, balanced with its explanatory power. And the further that a judgment about such plausibility and the judgment about how acceptable that distance is in light of the explanatory power is ultimately, he argues, in the eye of the beholder. To develop this idea, he follows, it expands upon a notion that Bas van Fraassen, a particular prominent anti-realist, the sort of purveyor of constructive empiricism, talks about. He himself talks about empiricism as a philosophical stance, and Chakravarti develops this notion in a bit more constrained way to talk about an epistemic stance with respect to, in particular, with respect to the question of scientific realism. And so, in a stance here, he's claiming are not particular claims or ideas or beliefs that someone has, but an orientation, a cluster of attitudes, commitments, and strategies relevant to the production of allegedly factual beliefs. They determine how human agents go about generating claims about the world that they may then believe. Stances themselves are not believed, but rather adopted by people, held by them, and expressed in their actions. It's not something. So a stance is not something you believe directly. It's, in a certain sense, the foundation upon which you build up your beliefs in reaction to various data or various observations. So in this context, we form, he argues, particular beliefs about the science and its claims based in part on the empirical data, models, and theories of science, but in light of the particular epistemic stance that we or an individual adopts and the epistemic values that that particular stance emphasizes. In light of all this, Chakravarti thinks that there are many epistemic stances that are rational, at least in the sense of being internally coherent, and is quite pessimistic that any of the more well-established stances found in this conversation can be effectively undermined or disproven, either by arguments directly against the values of the stance or by going after any particular belief about it. So while you might show that a particular belief is problematic within the context of that stance, the idea is you sort of adjust the belief without necessarily changing the stance. So out of this pessimism, though, he argues, given this reality, the nature of the debate is transformed. We can articulate our stances, put our epistemic values on the table for examination by ourselves and by others, explain how and why they resonate with us, invite others to empathize, and encourage the same with respect to our interlocutors. Now, to the Thomist, I would guess this voluntarist aspect of epistemology is at least a bit suspect, perhaps. And on the whole, Thomists are not known for being squeamish about wading into seemingly intractable intellectual debates, anathemas in hand, ready to launch left and right. That said, in the context of this particular conversation, Thomists in general, and I in particular, are a bit new to the table. And I think it would be wise to take advantage of the, at least, generosity of Chakravarti's proposal to lay out what exactly is a more Thomistic stance with respect to scientific ontology. As a starting point, it would be helpful to look at a couple examples of his own. So there are sort of three more concrete examples that Chakravarty focuses on, reflecting three broad approaches to scientific ontology. So the first he refers to is deflationary, which broadly speaking, it would include things like the idea that claims of science are completely historically contingent or socially contingent based off of social construct, or just sort of a pure pragmatism where all that science all that science is able to do is just be useful or productive, that it's not actually aiming for truth. And so broadly speaking, he sort of characterizes this stance with two ideas. First, the rejection of sort of traditional philosophical, i.e. a realist understanding of scientific ontology, that is just wrong-headed to presume that science is actually trying to say something about reality at all, and a posteriori, reject the analyses of truth and reference with which they are typically explicated. So they just proffer some other explanation for what the language of science is actually doing, not in the context of truth and reference as usually understood. A second, which he labels a more empiricist, which would include sort of classical, more instrumentalists, the logical empiricist, as well as the constructive empiricism of Van Frassen, rejects the demand for explanation in terms of things underlying the observable. So that's the first aspect of the stance, and following that, rejects attempts to answer these demands by theorizing about the unobservable. So it's broadly speaking, the very idea of trying to get below the unobservable is wrong-headed, and any attempt to do so should be rejected. And then he frames the third as the more metaphysical, under which he would include basically any of the various forms of scientific realism that are proffered, which is to accept the demands for explanation in terms of things underlying the observable, and attempt to answer these demands by theorizing about the unobservable. Now, again, within each of these, it goes to pains to say that there's a lot more specificity to be made there. So within the metaphysical, the sort of realist who is inclined to structural realism is going to end up with a different stance than one inclined to entity or other kinds of realism. With an empiricist, you can proffer that as well. But I want to point out, on the surface, it seems obvious, perhaps, that the Thomists should jump to the metaphysical and then try to work on that. Thomists are never queasy about reasoning about unobservable entities. It's a fairly common task, and would gravitate towards that third and just go for it. But I just want to take a moment to pause and to put this in the context of saying that, particularly looking at the second, more empiricist stance, because we are looking at this stance not necessarily in general, but specifically with respect to the question of scientific realism and what science is able to say about reality. So while any Thomist would be perfectly happy to talk about unobservable entities, it's not necessarily the case that they would necessarily want to use the tools of modern science as a stepping stone to claims about unobservable entities. So again, while the existence of Thomistic metaphysics, which presumes the existence of and intelligibility of immaterial realities like angels and God, the human soul, is clearly non-empiricist, with respect to the natural world, there is a distinctly empiricist edge to Aristotle and Aquinas, and a certain humility about how and where we can reasonably speculate. And to extend on this, I just want to point out, right, that from a historical example, that for Aquinas, there were natural phenomena that could be recognized as natural phenomena, but about which we had no hope for deeper explanation, and that it was wrong-headed to try to find one, precisely because their principles were, in a certain sense, non-empiricist, were not observable. Aquinas followed Aristotle in describing that most physical bodies, all physical bodies are mixtures of the four elements, in that most of their active and passive qualities can be explained in terms of the particular mixture of those four elements and the particular activity of the four primary qualities, hot, cold, wet, and dry, and that this was reasonable to do this because those four qualities were directly accessible to the senses. That knowledge comes through the senses. We can sense hot, cold, wet, and dry. We can recognize that and reason about the unobserved aspects of the mixture that go into a particular mixed body by recognizing the particular way in which those qualities manifested. But Aquinas also was certain that there were other natural powers. A couple examples would include magnets attracting iron, or rhubarb purging particular humors, more interesting ones like sapphire stopping bleeding, or gold cheering man's heart. So not all these are great, but the fundamental workings of these natural powers that we could see the effect, but the fundamental workings could not be explained by those qualities, and because the principles were inaccessible to our sensation, right? That magnets clearly don't work by some mixture of hot, cold, wet, and dry, and so we just don't have any tool by which we could observe, like we could sense the sensible principles that underlie magnetism. Therefore, we can't say anything intelligible about magnetism in terms of its principles. We can say there are magnets, they act this way, but we can't explain why magnetism works in the way that we can explain why other common properties of metals and animals and plants work by a mixture of exactly how the qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry work together. Now, again, we obviously need not follow these flawed conclusions of Aquinas all the way, but it's at least a warning to a Thomist that there is a streak of empiricism in Aquinas' approach to the natural world. We need to be prepared that there may be limits on what is sensed, or we should be prepared for limits on what is sensible to limit what we can find to be intelligible, what we can actually understand and try to argue about. So, let me then try to sort of frame, in a certain sense, this what I think is a broadly Thomistic stance, and I'm going to try to couch this in terms of the sort of three phrases that Chakravarti proposes in talking about stances: commitments, commitments, attitudes, and sorry, where'd it go? No, sorry, I apologize. All right, start with commitments. So Thomists are, and again, so focusing on this in the context of the question of scientific realism. So many of the things I'm going to put forward as commitments by Thomists are things that they have arguments for, and arguably at least arguments that are rooted in empirical claims, but are not themselves empirical or directly observable. So Thomists, broadly speaking, are committed to I'm pretty sure all Thomists, I hope, are committed to the idea that the physical world exists, that it manifests certain patterns of regularity and order in its changes and motions, and that human beings have some capacity to recognize and understand that order, at least in part. Broadly speaking, folks talking about science at all are probably at least open to that, but just to lay that out there. Now, that said then, where we get particularly Thomistic about this, the physical world is divided up, arguably tiled, although Thomas said there might be some debate there, into individual natural substances. The nature of a substance refers to both its passive openness to be affected or changed by other natural agents, its matter, or natura secundum materiae, and the source of its own spontaneous activity, its characteristic properties and behaviors, or its form, or natura secundum formale. Now again, there are Aristotelian Thomistic arguments for why this is the case. What I'm claiming here is that in the context of scientific realism, if we're going to make a claim that there is some sort of unobservable entity that science can tell us something about, it's going to have to be some aspect of this kind of entity. If there is a physical thing that is unobservable and yet we can know about in science, it's going to be a substance or somehow related to substances. Now, with that then, we recapitulate a few things that, coming from the moderate realism. So again, right, we have the nature of the substance that has this material aspect in terms of its passiveness and openness to be affected, as well as a kind of spontaneous activity, characteristic properties and activities that it manifests. And so natural substances are, again, these composites of matter and form understood at various levels. And to be way too quick about this, but just to kind of, in certain sense, make it more difficult, fundamentally, right, so a natural substance is a composition of prime matter and substantial form, where that substantial form actualizes the substance as a whole individual of a given nature and is the principle of all of its activity, is the fundamental principle of all its activity. There is on top of that, that's not enough. On top of that, there are accidental forms inhering in the substance, which actualize the substance to exist in a particular way. First, as existing and filling a particular quantity, or existing and filling a particular quantity or size, and then sort of in that inhering in a way in that quantitative aspect, there are various qualities, certain sensible properties or powers for activity, which can be distributed throughout the whole substance or localized in some particular quantitative part of it. So, I mean, for some of you, this is very familiar. I mean, the broad idea here is that, we come across a physical thing in some sense, at some sort of unobservable but real core. The fundamental principle of its existence is its substantial form, but that substantial form necessarily brings with it certain accidental features, the most fundamental of which is going to be quantity taking up some kind of volume or space, and then various qualities that manifest its various properties or activities, and these can be, depending on the kind of substance, sort of evenly distributed about the whole thing, or either a property of the whole, distributed about the whole, or localized in various ways. So I have, I am not the same color everywhere on my body. Like there are different, different qualities of color localized in various places. Now, importantly, and here I think where is a point where sometimes even Thomists get a little bit, or can get a little off, or not as precise as they might want to be. So substantial form is, again, the ultimate principle of activity in a substance. So if a substance is acting, anything the substance does, any actuality the substance has, is rooted in its substantial form, but it only ever actually acts through specific active qualities and powers. So that the substantial form doesn't do anything on its own or have anything on its the substantial form doesn't have any the activity of the substantial form is to make the thing be the kind of thing it is, and that is made manifest through the particular accidental qualities. The active and reactive powers of the substance may be localized in some quantitative part. Again, the substantial form is still the source, but it acts through the particular active qualities located in various parts. Right. And then, broadly speaking, other kinds of things that people might talk about as being, that sometimes people talk about fundamental, say, events, processes. These are ultimately, for the Thomists, going to be grounded in what substances are actually doing and how they're actually acting. There are various kinds of descriptions of the activity and motion of natural substances. So that's, in a certain sense, like a way too quick summary of rough aspects of Thomistic natural philosophy, and in broad sense, the kind of commitment about the nature of physical reality that Thomists is going to bring to any conversation. Where I think sometimes Thomists aren't as clear is in some of what I'm going to call attitudes, in terms of how it is that we have epistemic access to the substance. What is the attitude we should have towards natural substances? And the attitude about how it is that we expect to know about natural substances. And here I'm drawing on and referencing the work of James Weisshypel in the concept of nature. And he says that every physical reality manifests determined properties and behavior, and it is through such characteristics that different realities can be recognized, right? The human intellect, however, has no direct a priori knowledge of the essences or natures. It must carefully examine the sensible characteristics and behavior of natural bodies in various settings. So nature and substantial form are principles. That is to say, nature is not some complete entity within physical bodies which springs forth now and then in its performance. It neither is nor can be known as a complete entity. Our knowledge of it involves the experience of sensible manifestations and the realization that certain characteristic manifestations are spontaneously given in reality. Indeed, natures exist only in the concrete existing individual, so that our knowledge of nature in general, of any particular nature, involves the actual experience of innumerable individual phenomena. And in no way can our concept of nature be separated from these personal, as personally experienced. So, particularly Thomists of a more metaphysical bent often presume at times a sort of direct access to substantial form, and sometimes it is Thomistic portrayals of descriptions of the natural world are given as if there is some innate substantial form sense by which when we see something, we somehow immediately get access to the entirety of the substantial form or essence or nature of the thing. And that's just not what Aquinas thinks. That's not what Aristotle thinks. That what we have access to, like all knowledge comes to the senses, what we have access to are sensible aspects from which we reason to the fact that there is a substance and what kind of substance it is. Just as a fun Aquinas quote here, just in this context, hence they are to be laughed at, who, wishing to correct the definition of Aristotle about nature, try to define nature by something absolute, saying that nature is a power seated in things or something of this sort. Nature, as you know, with its sort of formal and material aspect, are principles. They're not things inherent in natural things. Okay. Now, this also means then that there are the other attitude that we need to bring here as a Thomist, properly speaking, is there are limitations on what the senses can reveal. There is no direct access to substantial forms, and Aquinas repeats this in various places. Just as one example from the questions on spiritual substances, substantial forms in themselves are unknown, but become known to us by their proper accidents. And substantial differences are frequently taken from accidents instead of from the substantial forms, which become known through such accidents. So there's a sense in which it is through accidents that we know what substances are, and through accidents that we distinguish between different substances. But there's a dichotomy here, because it's not because of the accident that the substance exists, and it's not because of the accident or the difference in accidents that the substances are different. That's in fact an effect of the inherent difference between the substances, or the inherent existence of the substance. And with that then is the just common Thomistic presumption or kind of epistemic humility that we cannot attain complete knowledge of the nature of anything. Sort of classic quote by Aquinas, but our manner of knowing is so weak that no philosopher could perfectly investigate the nature of even one little fly. So, all right. So I want to, I want to skip ahead a little bit for the sake of time. So the effect of a particular causal power, sensible or not, this is the other attitude I think it's important for the Thomist to bring is that there is a power to but limit in mathematics as a tool for describing and knowing physical things. Substances do have inherent geometric quantity. All physical substances have some size to them, quantitative aspects, and qualitative forms, and the sort of causal powers that are rooted in these qualitative accidental forms are actualized in and can often be characterized through particular quantitative parts. So, there's a certain, this portion of some object is a particular color, or the activity of, scintillation in a scintillation screen is located here in this place or this size. And the effect of particular causal powers, sensible or not, can be quantified based on the motions those things might induce. So by sort of translating in a way the fundamental qualitative aspect of the cause into a motion that can be quantified properly over distance or time, there is the possibility of putting quantities to qualities. So we can describe, we can talk about colors of light in terms of wavelengths and various examples like that. Okay. Good. So mathematical relations do reveal aspects, but not the entirety of the nature of any particular causal power, though, because these mathematical ideas are tools to recognizing aspects of the physical object and its causal powers, but it is not a mathematical object itself. And then sort of the final sort of attitude would be that the highest knowledge and certainty that we can have with respect to natural things is to define them through and to know them through the causes, which in this case includes efficient causality, but the broader context of material, formal, and final causality as well. Okay, now I am really going to skip ahead for the sake of time. So I've sort of put forward this. There's a lot of unobservable entities I've just proffered as the background for how Thomists, as kind of a Thomist stance. But what I want to argue here is that in the way in which that stance manifests in the particular conversation about scientific realism, there is a sense in which all of that is roughly limited, in the sense that science is an empirical study working through the sorts of things that can be measured and quantified. We are using a particular subset of the tools that Thomists might bring to bear, and so the kinds of questions specifically about scientific realism, about, okay, is this particular unobservable entity that say an electron or a proton or a particular natural kind, the tool by which the Thomist is going to try to argue for that is not immediately to jump to substantial form, not immediately jump to these unobservable entities, but is going to be primarily, first and foremost, through the sensible qualities that are, or sensible qualities and then things that can be measured in such a way to be sensible. So that it is through empirical evidence that we're going to make judgments about the existence or lack of existence of particular unobservable entities. Okay. Good. So again, this idea then, when a Thomist approaches the question of scientific realism, how do they actually, in practice, try to answer these questions? It's not by jumping straight to these unobservable entities. Good. All right. But it's looking for peculiar effects insofar as they form intelligible patterns, primarily patterns of observational data, and then accidental forms, and using accidental forms as directly sensible or as causally linked to the sensible effects in order to find an explanation for those interesting effects. So in translation, in a certain sense, what we're using as our tool in the conversation about scientific realism are what we should be looking for. first and foremost, are detectable causal powers or dispositions. And this, so the argument I want to make in the broader context of the stance is that while on the surface the Thomistic stance is going to look very strange to most contemporary philosophers of science, and the Thomistic stance opens the Thomist to asking further questions that contemporary philosophers of science might not be inclined to ask, that at least within a certain subset of common conversation, there is at least some potential for overlap. And in a certain sense, looking then, the second part, looking more particularly at Anjan Chakravarty's sort of preferred approach, his particular approach is what he calls either semi-realism or else dispositional realism, is to focus on these very causal properties as the primary referent in conversations about scientific realism. He has, going to skip over some history of realism. So he argues causal properties are the fulcrum of semi-realism. Their relations compose the concrete structures that are the primary subject matter of a tenable scientific realism. So he argues that it incorporates instincts from structural realism, and they regularly cohere to form interesting units, and these groupings make up the particulars investigated by the sciences and described by scientific theories. So again, that it gives you access to entities, which is an instinct coming from entity realism, and entities as sources of causal activity, either things that you can causally engage with or can use to causally engage with other things. And the continuous manifestation of the dispositions they confer constitutes the causal processes to which empirical investigations become connected, so as to produce knowledge of things they study. So he argues scientific realists reach beyond the observable to claim knowledge of certain unobservable properties, structures, and particulars, and by doing so enter into the speculative water of metaphysics. So on the surface, the Thomist is happy to broadly run with this. There's a way in which, at least on the surface of it, this instinct of starting from causal powers with sort of qualities in its mystic sense understood as the accidental forms of qualities being the means by which substances engage in causal interaction. But there's a sense in which Chakravarty's next step in proposing this starts to raise some questions for the Thomist. And I think this is, this is interesting in clarifying a kind of instinct about what a Thomist can or the presumption about what a Thomist thinks they might be able to say or not say about the physical reality. So Chakravarty argues proposes what he calls the dispositional identity thesis, that a particular causal property can be identified as the property that it is in virtue of its relation to other properties. The conjunction, and then with that then, he argues that sort of the conjunction of all the causal laws, all the actual ways in which causes interact, thus specifies the natures of all causal properties. Roughly speaking, what it is to be a causal property is have a disposition, and that the identity of a causal property is completely determined by its potential for contributing to the causal powers of the things that have it. So what it is to have a particular causal power is just the sum total of all the ways that this causal power could relate to any other causal powers that are out there, in a rough sense. He's not saying you have to have knowledge of all of that. He thinks you clearly don't have that, but he thinks that the underlying foundation for distinguishing different kinds of causal powers is the way in which these causal powers, the sum total of the way a particular kind of causal power interacts with any other kind of causal power or similar causal powers that are out in a particular context. So there is something very intriguing about this dispositional identity thesis, and there are times when I think it's very close to right. Namely, right, it's an argument, and there are a lot of interesting fruit that he draws from this for claiming about sort of consistent accounts of natural necessity. But what I want to push ahead a little bit on is two kind of Thomistic worries about this account of dispositional identity as the foundation for what it is to be a particular disposition, being somehow the sum total of all potential interactions with other causal dispositions. And I think I'm going to skip my first one and jump to my second one, just because I think it's I think a bit more interesting and ties in a little bit with some of the previous conversation about modeling. And this is that there is at foundation for Aquinas an inherent corruptibility and fallibility of the physical. And while mathematical relations are very useful tools for identifying and describing causal systems, causal powers are not themselves mathematical entities and can only ever approximately instantiate the mathematical tendencies. If we describe this system of causal powers in sort of mathematical context, which is the mode in which Chakravarti proposes it, the actual physical instantiation of any of these causes is never going to perfectly match that. So to illustrate this, I think it's helpful to touch on another Thomistic notion of how natural efficient causes can fail to achieve what they tend towards, how it is that causes might fail to do what they tend to do. So it's clear that Aquinas thinks that one obvious way that a particular kind of natural efficient cause fails is when some other efficient cause interrupts it and interferes with it. And this is sort of a paradigmatic example of chance for him. For instance, right, so the natural downward fall of a rock is interrupted by the head of a passing wolf, diverting the rock's natural trajectory and possibly the wolf's very existence. And some Thomists presume this is the only sense in which there's chance. And historically, various Thomists and scholastics thought this was the only sense in which that natural powers could fail. The implication being that, setting aside questions of human agency, that nature ends up becoming deterministic. The only way in which a natural power fails is if something else interferes with it. And so if you understand how natural powers work, properly speaking, the system by which they work is going to become deterministic. So following some, I think, very great work from Charles de Koninck in the 1930s on indeterminacy, I'm convinced that Aquinas thinks that there is a further possibility that a natural cause simply fails to achieve its ends because of the weakness of natural agents and their inability to perfectly actualize the pure potency of prime matter. De Koninck argues that this means that for Aquinas, his philosophy of nature is inherently, in some context, indeterministic, that it's, as a whole, not a deterministic system. And that even without any external interference, some causes simply do fail to perfectly achieve the effects that in other contexts they might do. To be a bit too glib about it, I mean, this is just carrying out of Aquinas' or of Aristotle's idea of nature acting always or for the most part. That there's an inherent fallibility of at least corruptible natural causes. Now, okay, just to be clear, Chakravarti is not demanding actual determinism in his advocacy of this dispositional identity thesis. And he's open to the fact that relations between causal powers can be probabilistic. But I think even this is too constrained for the Thomist. And this might be a point where Thomists would disagree with me. That the mathematical patterns that underlie the relations between various causal powers, whether we can express whether those can be expressed, sort of univocally, without probabilities, or with probabilities, do hold approximately. They're really darn good. I love particle physics, and the math is awesome, and maybe nearly perfectly, but I think that even here there must be at least some, and perhaps, in many contexts, unnoticeable imperfection of the mathematical pattern when it is actually instantiated in a physical system, in the way in which physical causes actually act. And I think there are sort of Thomistic grounds for arguing for this. So I think this also puts then some fundamental sort of disconnect between the Thomist stance and any sort of hard sense of an absolute sort of semantic literalism about scientific theories. That there's always going to be some aspect of approximation there, just built into the very materiality of matter from the Thomistic perspective. I think, again, whether that would cash out in practice in arguing about a particular unobservable entity, I think the difference might be so small that I could sit down with Chakravarti and come to an agreement about how to argue for the probability of certain kinds of entities. But I think ultimately there is going to be a difference. And so the route in which the Thomist is going to talk about the identity of dispositions is going to be different. It's ultimately going to be rooted in not just in their potency, not just in what they could do, but also in what they actually are, which necessarily is connected to the substance that they're coming from. We should not expect that to necessarily show up in the scientific description of what's going on, but it colors the way that we talk about it. Okay, so I don't have any time to actually talk about particle physics. I apologize. Just one last just thing I want to say about the Thomistic stance. To be fully honest, right, about the Thomistic stance and putting forward the sort of epistemic values in the way that Chakravarti argues for it, I would argue that the epistemic values that Thomists find attractive in this stance clearly go beyond questions of scientific ontology and scientific realism. And in fact, I was not first or primarily convinced of Thomistic natural philosophy because of any particular because it answered some question in particle physics that I or some aporia I had there. But I am convinced that it does have value in this regime, but I have, in a certain sense, greater confidence in the Thomistic stance, now more broadly construed in terms of sort of Thomistic synthesis, because of its connection to and role in other intellectual contexts, to anthropology and questions about the human person, in ethics, and most especially in theology. So it is in stepping back and seeing how this stance draws from the Thomistic natural philosophy and links it to the broader Thomistic synthesis that I am most confident in the kind of Thomistic stance towards these questions. Now, so I just put this forward as from I think the contemporary conversation, the kinds of claims that Thomists make sound strange. And they sound out of place, and the reason for them can be confusing. I think there are internal ways to argue for at least the plausibility of the broader Thomistic understanding of natural philosophy in a scientific context, and to argue that at least on certain grounds we can be fellow travelers to a certain extent. But I think it's worth noting that not only is the Thomistic stance open to the idea of broader unificatory explanatory power in the context of scientific realism, but it immediately opens up to a broader unificatory power in reality as a whole, philosophy as a whole, and theology. And while that might not be the particular that might not be important for the particular details of the conversation you're having. In this context of talking about stances, I think it's important to put the Thomistic cards on the table with that. So with that, I appreciate your patience, and I apologize for going over. I should know better. Thank you.